Hello, scholars. Let's talk about the Baroque. First off, if you go to the link next to this video on your slide, there is a recording of Baroque music. If you can open that up in a second tab, then it'll allow you to listen to some Baroque music while you're also listening to me speak. That way you get a better flavor of what Baroque is actually like. Baroque music is a musical genre. A genre is a kind of music that is written during a certain time frame. So another genre might be, for example, rap or country or jazz. In this case, Baroque. Baroque music was written primarily between 1610 and 1750. No, you don't need to write this down. There is no quiz, but if you'd like to write it down to keep it in your memory, you may do so. 1610 to 1750. That's an awful lot of time, and we need to note that it's not like they woke up on the morning of 1610, January 1st, and said, we're going to write Baroque style. It slowly kind of started to make its way in, and at the end it slowly made its way out. But those are the dates that we use. So let's talk about what Baroque means. The term Baroque is actually French, and it means something malformed or something formed incorrectly, and it refers to jewelry. It was used as a way of saying that a pearl in a necklace was malformed or formed incorrectly. So a Baroque item would be something that is deformed. A deformed pearl is actually the common definition of Baroque. And it was a way of saying that the music that was being written was so ugly that it was kind of like a deformed pearl. It was weird shaped and it was kind of out there and they didn't like it. The problem is, it wasn't written to be ugly at all. It was written to be beautiful. And today, we still use this music as something that's creepy or something that's kind of spooky or weird, and we don't necessarily give it the appreciation that it deserves. So today, I'm going to challenge you to listen to Baroque music and not think of it as creepy, because it was never written to be creepy. What instruments do we see as creepy? The organ and the harpsichord. They usually tend to get thought of as creepy, and they're not. They were never meant to be. They were just instruments making beautiful music. But over the years, they have been used by Hollywood, especially when we're making movies that need haunted house scenes or Dracula scenes or spooky old person scenes. If you're like a spooky, like creepy old person, whatever, they might get a harpsichord sound. Or if you're looking at maybe traveling back in time to something dark and mysterious, they'll get maybe an organ sound or maybe a harpsichord sound. And that's not what this music was intended to be at all. Most of it was actually intended to be beautiful, even worshipful music. So I challenge you today to think of Baroque as more than creepy. Don't let it become a deformed pearl. Now, the reason why we still use that name is because the composers who wrote in the Baroque style decided to use the name and to say that they were going to take it on as their own and they were going to be proud of it, even if other people made fun of it. So they stood up for themselves and for what they believed was beautiful music. So, now that we know where the word Baroque comes from, and no, it does not mean Baroque as in broken, despite what happens in Beauty and the Beast when he says, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it. That's not what it actually means. It does actually mean deformed pearl. Now let's talk about different things that made Baroque music Baroque. Here are the things. Number 1, orchestra for the first time. Well, for the first time that it's written down. Before this time, especially in the Renaissance, you never would have written down musical instruments. You would have used them, but it was considered not so good to be an instrumentalist because there had been a philosopher many years before then in the an ancient philosopher who wrote that instrumental music was the lowest level of music. The highest was the sound of the spheres. It was the closest to God. So the music of the planets, which we now know doesn't exist. And then second was the natural sounds of the world. So water, thunder, lightning, cat's meow, dog bark, or human voice. That's the second level. It's because God made that sound. And then the third level is the man-made instrument. That's the lowest level. So there was kind of this attitude against instruments. People used them, but they didn't bother to write down what they were doing. We know they were used because people wrote descriptions about them and painted pictures of them, but we don't have a lot of music written with music notes for musical instruments, so we don't actually know what a lot of their stuff sounded like. Until the Baroque, when people finally decided to start just writing down what the instruments were doing, and that's when we created the orchestra. The orchestra back then was very different. It had a basso continuo, meaning a bass line, made up of some kind of a keyboard instrument, like a harpsichord, and some kind of a low bass instrument, like a double bass. Today, we use a low bass instrument today to create a bass line too, in every pop song you've ever listened to. So we've stuck with that same idea. The next thing you'd have in an orchestra would be some kind of a string section, something similar to some violins, something like a viola or the viola of the time, viola da gamba, and then you would have something else too to go along with it, maybe something a little bit lower. That is the string section. Then you might have a flute, or you might have some kind of a trumpet. You put that together and you have a Baroque orchestra. It's not very big, maybe 10 people, maybe 15, 20 if you're really, really big, usually not. So that would be an orchestra. It's a lot smaller than we have today, 60 members, 80 members today, much bigger. But that's where orchestra got its start. So the number one thing we need to know about with Baroque, we get orchestras. Number two thing we need to know about Baroque, we stop thinking about music as all individual people or individual things, and we start thinking of music as one big giant group and how every piece sounds together, sounds good together, or sounds bad together. That sounds silly, but that's actually a really new thought process. People didn't think of music that way before. They thought about how this singer would sound, and then this singer would sound, and then this singer would sound, singing these three different lines at the same time, but how they'd all sound by themselves. Now we start thinking about how everybody works together to make music in one big giant chunk. That means that we start adding in more kinds of music at the same time. Maybe there might have been 4 people performing at the same time, and they're performing 4 different lines. Now there might be 8 people performing at the same time, and they're performing 8 different lines of music. It all blends together. This is when we start to see the word harmony really come into use, because we're thinking about how sounds sound together, not how they sound by themselves. So that's the important thing number 2. Orchestra, we work together as a group. Thing number 3, new instruments or the new use of instruments. The piano's grandmother comes into play now, and that's the harpsichord. The piano's great-great-grandmother, the virginal, is also being used. Piano's not born yet, but it's coming, just not yet. So we see the harpsichord and the virginal. The reason why we tend not to like that sound anymore today is because it's kind of an abrasive or rough sound. The harpsichord doesn't play like a piano. A piano, as you know from our days of dissecting a piano, the piano, you strike the string and it makes the noise. With the harpsichord, it plucks the string. A little lever comes out and goes thunk like that on the string, and it creates a very tinny think, think, think noise. It also can't pluck it harder or softer, so no matter how hard you slam your fingers down on those keys, it's going to make the same sound as if you just pushed your finger lightly. Either way, it just goes thunk. You can slam it, goes thunk. You can go like that and it goes thunk. It's always the same sound. So the harpsichord today, we don't care for it as much, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't a beautiful instrument, and it is a wonderful grandmother to the piano. The other instrument that's really starting to come into its own in this time frame is the organ. Organs have been around since the 10th century. They're not new, but new technology allows them to become bigger and better. So that's when you get these big, massive pipe organs, which today, again, Hollywood has told us are spooky. But in reality, they were meant to make beautiful music in churches to really worship God as best as they possibly could. They were really cool instruments that actually had air running through the pipes all the time through boys on treadmills working behind the organs. They'd pay little boys to be on these treadmills and just run, 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 run. And it would pump the air. It would pump air into the organ, and the organ would then make noise. Can you imagine that being your job? That you just get to stand on a treadmill all day and run, 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 so that the organ player can play their instrument. So that's another big instrument that comes around during this time frame. The organ gets really, really big and fancy, and the harpsichord. Now we know about the new instruments. Let's talk about what's happening during this time frame. The Baroque time frame, again, is from 1610 to 1750. And a lot happens in Europe during that time. You get the end of the Counter-Reformation, when the Catholic Church is responding to all of the new Protestants and trying to make reforms and ways to make their change some of the things that are making people upset. So, with the Counter-Reformation comes a lot of new rules about how music should sound, like we should be able to understand the words. Renaissance music wasn't so easy to understand the words, but you'll see that in Baroque music, you understand the words a bit better. You also see that music is there on purpose to be for God and not to be for being fancy or decorative. So you'll find some music is very plain, but then some music is also very fancy. It just depends on what your viewpoint is. You'll also find that there's a lot of interesting things that are happening politically. For example, there's a lot of upheaval in Prussia at the time, the area that we now refer to as Central Europe. And Germany, oh my goodness, it's all up in war. There's also the revolution over in England at the time. In 1649, the Commonwealth overthrows the king, beheads the king, and there's a puritanical rule for a while in England before the king is put back on their throne, the next king down. So there's revolution and rebellion in England. That sends a lot of the Puritans off to colonize the Americas, and so we see the rise of colonies in North America. We see that most of our really early American history actually takes place during this time. In fact, one of the great moments of note in American history, a very dark moment in American history, the Salem witch trials, takes place in 1691, right during the middle of this time. In fact, this time ends in 1750, and our Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. So most of our early days as a colony were actually during this time frame. So they would have heard of Baroque music. They may have had some Baroque orchestras, not as many in America because religious people in America were not as interested in music, but they would have known some, absolutely. So that's what's happening across the world. Let's go ahead and go in really quickly to two little pieces of Baroque. We've talked about you have to perform in an orchestra and in a group, and we've talked about new instruments. Now let's go into two little features about Baroque music, and those are long lines called melismas and decorative pieces called ornamentation. A long line called melisma is something totally new. It means I'm just going to sing this long line of music as long as I possibly can, and the composer's going to write it in for me, and it's just going to go on forever. And that was very stylish in the Baroque. So a singer could sing some line where they're going, like they're singing a word, they're like, and they're just going on and on forever. And that is very, very popular in the Baroque. We think of that today as maybe a little bit too fancy, garish, maybe too much. And a violin player would be expected to do it. A trumpet player would be expected to do it. Anybody would have to do it. And you'll see a lot of Baroque music that has that. Another thing that you'll see that we still use today is called ornamentation. Think of it as like putting a Christmas tree ornament on your tree. You're decorating it. And an ornamentation moment is a decoration for music. I'm going to sing the Star Spangled Banner once with no ornamentation. Then I'm going to sing it with Baroque ornamentation, and then I'm going to sing it with ornamentation that we would use today. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? Just the line, nothing special. That's just the way it sounds. Now let me go ahead and add in some Baroque ornamentation. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? Did you hear those little moments where I kind of like made those scoops? That's Baroque ornamentation. Now let me show you what modern ornamentation would sound like. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? Modern ornamentation. That extra stuff that I added in. Everything that Mariah Carey and Ariana Grande do, that's Baroque in a way. That started in the Baroque, and it now is being used today in pop music. So that is ornamentation. These are two very special features, the melisma, the long line, and the ornamentation that you will see across Baroque music and all across your listening examples for this unit. So now we know orchestra, big groups, or thinking together as a group. New instruments, melismas, long lines, ornamentation, making things more fancy. And then music that was made during a time where there was a lot of political upheaval, a lot of things happening in Europe at the time. These are the things that are very important about the Baroque. That and there's new instruments or new use of instruments. So we put all that together, and let's talk about our three composers for this unit before I let you move on to exploring the Baroque. Do I want to do three? I think I'm going to do four. Four composers. There's one I think I'm going to go ahead and include. So let's start off with number one. Monteverdi, Claudio Monteverdi. He's an Italian composer. He's right at the beginning of it, and he's kind of the one who starts it. Claudio Monteverdi starts off as a Renaissance composer, switches over to the Baroque in 1610 when he writes his Vespers. His Vespers are the first major piece of music that has orchestra for a sacred piece of music. Oh, so crazy, so new. And he writes beautiful music that works with all of the different things we've already talked about as being Baroque. Monteverdi worked for a family called the Gonzaga family. They lived in Mantua, which is a city in Italy, and they were dukes and duchesses of the city-state. They were very wealthy, and he was their court composer, and he wrote opera. He wrote madrigals, which are love songs. He wrote pieces of music that were sacred. He wrote a lot of different kinds of music. He wrote a lot of music. In fact, his opera, Orfeo ed Euridice, is today considered the first opera that has stood the test of time. There were some earlier operas, but his was the first big one, and we still perform it today. So he wrote a lot of music, and he's the one who kind of got the Baroque up and running. In fact, he wrote the Secunda Practica, or the second practice, which describes the Baroque sound for the first time. And it was a music critic named Artusi, was the first musical critic, the first writer that complained about this new horrible sound. So Monteverdi was the one who got things started. Now let's move on to the father of all things modern music, and that is Johann Sebastian Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach lived in Germany, and he lived from 1685, my mistake, from 1685 to 1750. He died in 1750. And he worked primarily for two different churches, with his big one being in a city called Leipzig. And he was an organist, and he wrote for different instruments, and he wrote for choirs, and he wrote for organ. And he was a church musician throughout his life. He had 21 children, and today, when we study music in college, we study the rules that he created. We study all of the different ideas that he put together for how to make music sound good. So when you take a music test or when you learn about music, you're usually learning rules that he helped put together. He didn't actually write these rules down, but he followed them over and over and over again. And so we have learned to follow them too. The next composer we're going to talk about is Handel. George Frederick Handel lived from 1685 to 1759. Same time frame pretty much as Bach. And he started off in Germany. He was born in Germany, but he ended up moving to England because he loved England so much. He wrote a lot of different kinds of music, opera, music for just instrumental groups, choral music. He wrote everything you can imagine. His most famous piece of music today still is an oratorio. And an oratorio is a sacred piece of music that has no acting in it, but it still works like an opera. In this case, he wrote a piece of music that talked about the life of Jesus, and then Jesus's death, and then the prophecies of what will happen after Jesus returns. This is called the Messiah, or actually just Messiah. Handel's Messiah was written in 1741. It is still the most popular piece of choir music performed in the world, and you know it by the Hallelujah Chorus. The next composer we're going to talk about, who is absolutely Baroque, is Vivaldi. Vivaldi wrote for strings and choir mostly. He was known as the red-headed priest because apparently there weren't a lot of redheads in Venice where he lived, and he was the music director for a girls' orphanage in Venice. They took poor girls who had no parents, and they raised them to be very, very elegant young ladies who were able to marry into wealthy parts of society. And it was very important that these girls be very good at music. And so he trained them and wrote music for them, which is why most of his music is for choir and strings, because those were the kinds of instruments and the singers he had available for him at the girls' school where he worked. So these are your Baroque composers: Monteverdi, Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi. There are so many more, but those are 4 really good ones to get started with. Enjoy this unit on the Baroque. If you have any questions, you can email me. I would like to see some journal entries from you, especially with your opinions about the Baroque. And I challenge you during this unit to remember, try not to think of this music as creepy. These composers didn't think of their music as creepy. They thought of it as beautiful. Hollywood has turned this music into creepy for many years. Don't let Hollywood influence your opinions. Don't let them make you think of this as a deformed pearl. Instead, think of it for what it was meant to be: beautiful music that has its own very unique style. Thank you so much, scholars. Bye-bye.